The fire reached her sleeve before anyone else in the garage even smelled smoke. Wade Prescott didn't shout a warning. He grabbed the burning fabric of Marisol Vega's jacket and tore it clean off her arm in one motion, fast enough that the flame went out against the concrete before it ever touched her skin. 5 people stood close enough to see everything that happened next, and not one of them, in the 4 years Marisol had worked at that garage, had ever seen what was underneath that sleeve. What the whole garage saw underneath that torn sleeve stopped every conversation in the building cold. Ridgeline Cycle and Repair sat on the edge of Truett, Texas. 3 bays and a gravel lot that filled up most Saturdays with more motorcycles than cars, close enough to the highway that the smell of asphalt heat mixed year-round with motor oil and the particular scorch of a welding torch running somewhere in the back. A faded sign above the office door still read the shop's original name from before Hank Ruiz bought it 15 years ago. A detail nobody had gotten around to fixing because regulars had stopped noticing the mismatch years back. The shop had built its reputation over 11 years on doing honest work at honest prices and had become, without anyone officially deciding it, the unofficial garage of choice for half the Longhorn Motorcycle Club and most of the county's serious riders besides. Even in July, with the thermometer outside the office door reading past 100 most afternoons, the shop ran 3 box fans at full blast, and everyone still sweated through their shirts by noon, the concrete floor staying warm long after the sun went down. Wade Prescott had been bringing his bikes to Ridgeline for 6 years, ever since a chapter brother recommended the place after a bad experience elsewhere, and had become, over that time, one of Marisol's regular Saturday customers. The kind of relationship built entirely on mutual respect for good work rather than much personal conversation. At 42, Wade had ridden with the Longhorn Club for close to 2 decades, had served 2 tours overseas before that in a role he rarely discussed, and had learned, in both places, to trust a person's hands over their small talk. He didn't know much about Marisol, beyond the fact that she was, by a wide margin, the best diagnostic mechanic Ridgeline had, and that she wore a long-sleeve jacket at her station every single day of the year, regardless of the heat. A detail he'd noticed and never once asked about, the way you don't ask people questions that are plainly none of your business. Before we get to what that torn sleeve revealed, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. I read every single one of them. Now, back to that garage bay. On a Saturday morning that had started out like every other Saturday at Ridgeline, because a small spark was about to expose 15 years Marisol Vega had spent making sure nobody at Ridgeline ever saw what she was hiding. Marisol Vega had been the best mechanic at Ridgeline for 4 years running, promoted twice since Hank Ruiz hired her fresh out of a technical program that had graduated exactly 3 women in a class of 40. She had grown up taking apart small engines with her father in their apartment complex's shared garage before she was old enough to drive, and had known, long before she enrolled anywhere formally, that she wanted to spend her life with grease under her fingernails rather than behind a desk. She had earned every bit of her reputation the hard way, in a shop where more than one customer over the years had asked, within her own earshot, whether a man might take a second look at their bike before they trusted her diagnosis. She answered that particular condescension the same way every time, by being right more often than anyone else in the building, until even her harshest doubters had learned to wait for her verdict before arguing with it. What none of them knew, because Marisol had made absolutely certain of it for 15 years, was that her left arm and most of her shoulder carried burn scarring severe enough that she had not worn short sleeves in public since she was 19 years old. An apartment fire had torn through her family's building in the middle of the night that year. Faulty wiring in a unit 2 floors down, spreading faster than the building's ancient smoke detectors could keep up with. smoke already thick enough in the hallway that Marisol had to feel her way along the wall to find her brother's door. Marisol, the only one awake when the smoke alarm finally worked, had gone back through that hallway to pull her 8-year-old brother Nico out of a bedroom whose door had already started to blister with heat, wrapping her own arm across her face for the last few feet before remembering, too late, that the fabric of her sleeve had already begun to smolder against the doorframe she'd braced herself on. She'd gotten him out, carrying him the last 20 feet after her legs nearly gave out from the smoke, and had not fully understood how badly her own arm had been burned until the adrenaline wore off outside on the sidewalk, and a firefighter's flashlight passed over her arm long enough for his expression to tell her before the pain fully caught up to what her body already knew. The burns she carried afterward, 3rd degree across her upper arm and shoulder, had taken 4 surgeries and 2 years to stabilize. Skin grafts that changed the texture and color of nearly 1/3 of her upper body, and had taught her, long before she ever picked up a wrench professionally, exactly how people's faces changed when they saw the scars for the first time. Sympathy curdling too easily, in her experience, into something closer to discomfort or pity. Occasionally, even a stare held a beat too long to feel like anything but intrusion. She had decided, by the time she enrolled in her technical program, that a shop full of men already inclined to doubt her didn't need one more reason, and had built her entire wardrobe since around making sure they never got the chance, buying long-sleeved work shirts 2 sizes too large specifically so the fabric never clung close enough to hint at what was underneath. Boyd Callum, a semi-retired mechanic who still came by most weeks to needle the younger staff and offer opinions nobody asked for, had been one of Marisol's steadiest skeptics from her first month at Ridgeline, prone to hovering over her shoulder on complicated jobs and asking pointed questions he'd never have asked a male mechanic with her exact credentials. He'd spent 35 years in the trade before easing into semi-retirement, and had built a good chunk of his identity around being the most experienced set of hands in any garage he walked into. An identity Marisol's steady competence quietly threatened every time she diagnosed something faster than he could have. He wasn't cruel about it, exactly, just certain, in the particular way older men in that trade sometimes were, that experience like his own couldn't possibly be matched by someone half his age who hadn't come up the same way he had. That Saturday, Wade had brought his bike in for a fuel line that had been running rough for 2 weeks, and Marisol had traced it to a cracked line seeping vapor near a wiring harness that had worn through its casing, the kind of combination that made every mechanic in the shop nervous the moment she pointed it out, Boyd included, who'd looked at the same bike a week earlier and missed it entirely. She was reaching in close to disconnect the line when a spark off the exposed wiring caught the vapor, a flash rather than an explosion, gone in under 2 seconds. But 2 seconds was long enough to catch the edge of her sleeve where it brushed against the frame, the fabric catching faster than either of them expected, given how far her arm actually was from the worst of the flash. Wade was standing 18 inches away, checking a torque spec on his own clipboard, and reacted before his mind had finished registering what his eyes had seen. 2 decades of instinct, built from a different kind of emergency taking over before conscious thought caught up. He crossed the distance in a single step, closed his hand around the burning cuff of her jacket, and ripped the entire sleeve away from the shoulder seam in one hard pull, fabric tearing free and hitting the concrete already curling black at the edges. The flame died against the floor a half-second later, smothered by the concrete, before it could do anything more than singe the seam it had started on. Marisol stood there breathing hard, more startled than hurt, her bare left arm and shoulder fully exposed for the first time in 15 years, to a room full of people she worked beside every day, her free hand instinctively reaching for a sleeve that was no longer there to grab. The garage went silent in a way none of them had words for immediately. 5 people staring at scarring severe enough to make clear, instantly, that whatever had caused it had been considerably worse than anything that had almost just happened. The 2 other mechanics on shift had stopped mid-task, one still holding a socket wrench loosely at his side, as if he'd forgotten what it was for, and a customer waiting near the office door had gone quiet enough that the box fans suddenly seemed loud by comparison, the whole garage holding its breath in a way none of them would have predicted an ordinary Saturday could produce. Boyd, of all people, was the first to break the silence, his voice gone smaller than anyone had heard it in the 4 years he'd been coming around. "Marisol," he said, "what happened to you?" She pulled her arms across her chest instinctively, the old reflex kicking in a full second before she remembered there was nothing left to hide it with, her face already flushing with an embarrassment 15 years of careful wardrobe choices had been built specifically to prevent. Wade, still holding the torn sleeve, set it down gently on the workbench rather than let it drop, giving her a moment before he spoke. "You don't owe anybody an explanation," he said quietly, loud enough only for her. "Not one word of it. Not today, not ever, unless you want to give it." Marisol looked at him a long moment, then around at the rest of the shop, 5 faces waiting not with the pity she'd spent 15 years dreading, but with something closer to concern and, underneath it, plain astonishment. "I was 19, she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected it to be, the words coming easier once she'd started than she'd imagined they would after 15 years of never saying them out loud to a single person at work. "Our apartment building caught fire in the middle of the night. My little brother's room was already full of smoke by the time I got to him. I got him out. This is what I got out with." The garage stayed quiet a moment longer, the only sound the box fans still cycling warm air. And then Boyd, the man who'd spent 4 years finding small ways to question her competence, said the only thing that seemed to matter in that moment. "You've been hiding that," he said, "while I've been standing over your shoulder, questioning whether you know how to read a torque wrench." He didn't dress it up further than that, but the shame in it was plain enough that nobody needed him to elaborate. Hunk Ruiz, who'd hired Marisol 4 years earlier and had quietly fielded more than one customer complaint about trusting his best mechanic's judgment over the years, stood in his office doorway through most of the aftermath saying very little, though he pulled Marisol aside before she left that day and told her, plainly, that if he'd known any of this, he'd have shut down every single one of those complaints a lot faster than he had. Marisol told him she hadn't wanted him to know, and Hank said he understood that better now than he had an hour earlier, but that it wasn't going to stop him from doing better by her going forward regardless. Word of what happened at Ridgeline moved through the Longhorn chapter within days, not through any dramatic announcement, but through Wade quietly mentioning it to his road captain over coffee, who mentioned it to 2 more members, each conversation carrying the same disbelief that a shop regular had been hiding a rescue like that under long sleeves for 15 years, without a single person asking. A member who worked as a paralegal did some digging on her own time and found the original 2011 news coverage of the fire, a short local article that had run the week it happened and never once followed up, quoting a fire captain, calling Nico's rescue the only reason that apartment building hadn't recorded a fatality that year. The article ran 4 paragraphs and a single photograph of the scorched building. No follow-up piece, no mention of Marisol by name beyond a passing reference to the resident who pulled her brother out. Marisol had moved 3 times since then, chasing work, first for the technical program and then for jobs, and the recognition that should have followed her had simply never caught up. Filed away in a newspaper archive nobody in Truett had any reason to search. The Longhorn Motorcycle Club worked with Truett's fire department to correct that 15 years late, arranging a proper commendation ceremony at the station where Marisol's original rescue had never been formally honored, inviting the same fire captain, now long retired, who remembered the call clearly enough to speak about it without notes, telling the small crowd that he'd thought about that particular fire more than almost any other in his 30-year career, specifically because the girl who'd caused the department's shortest, easiest cleanup that night had never once come back to be thanked properly. The Longhorn chapter filled 2 rows of folding chairs at the ceremony, most of them men Marisol had spent years fixing motorcycles for without ever mentioning any of this. Several visibly emotional in a way none of them would have predicted about themselves a month earlier. A few of the older riders admitting afterward that they'd needed a minute alone in the parking lot before they trusted themselves to speak to her directly. Nico Vega, 23 now and working as an electrician 2 towns over, stood beside his sister throughout the ceremony and told the small crowd gathered that he still had a photograph of himself at 8 years old sitting on the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a blanket, looking for the sister who just saved his life and finding her already being loaded into a second ambulance instead. An image that had shaped, he said, nearly everything he understood about what family was supposed to mean. He'd brought the photograph with him, worn soft at the corners from being carried in his wallet for years, and pressed it into his sister's hands before he sat back down. Marisol wears short sleeves at Ridgeline now, on the days the heat makes long sleeves genuinely unbearable, and has stopped flinching at the questions that occasionally come with it, telling the story plainly to anyone who asks the way she never once let herself before that Saturday. A few new customers still do the double take she spent 15 years dreading. But she's found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it bothers her considerably less now that the people she actually works beside every day already know the whole of it and have made clear exactly how they feel about her because of it, rather than despite it. Boyd hasn't questioned a single one of her diagnoses since, and has taken, instead, to introducing her to new customers himself, telling them plainly that she's the best mechanic in the building, and that he'd know, having spent years being wrong about exactly that. Wade still brings his bikes to Ridgeline every few weeks, and has never once brought up the fire again unless Marisol raises it first, understanding, in the same way he understood not to ask about her sleeves for 6 years, that some things are hers to bring into a conversation, and nobody else's to reach for first. A torn sleeve revealed scars Marisol Vega had spent 15 years making sure nobody ever saw. The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was respect, arriving 15 years later than it should have. If you believe the quietest people in the room sometimes carry the loudest kind of courage, tell us where you're watching from tonight. I read every comment.